In this lecture, we're going to deal with one of the most remarkable parts of the narrative describing the rise of the Ottoman Empire. And we're going to deal with a period in which the Ottoman Empire came really to the brink of collapse as a result of the defeat of Bayezid the Thunderbolt, the man who had won all those great victories over the last 12 years, and he's defeated by the great steppe conqueror Tamerlane. And then a revival under the sultans Mehmed I and Murat II. Mehmed I and Murat II are respectively the grandfather and the father of Mehmed the Conqueror, Mehmed Fethiye, who's coming up in the next lecture, and who is often regarded as Mehmed the Great, perhaps the greatest sultan really of all of the 10 remarkable sultans in the earlier period. And I always think of both Mehmed I and Murat II as not having nearly the reputation of their grandson or son because that Mehmed II is known as the Great. And there's always a problem when you are followed by a son who is greater than the father. You tend to get missed in the historical record. And so this lecture is going to concentrate on those three sultans, Bayezid the Thunderbolt in his later years, and then Mehmed I and Murat II. Now, the last time we were lecturing, we dealt with Bayezid at the Battle of Nicopolis in 1396. That was the last major issue we were discussing. And in September of 1396, Bayezid had won perhaps the most brilliant victory of any Ottoman sultan for the first time over a Western crusade. And that battle literally vindicated his reign. He went on to subject the various vassal states in the Balkans. Many of the Orthodox princes in Bulgaria and Serbia bowed to his rule. He also put the city of Constantinople under siege because he realized that a Byzantine emperor in Constantinople had been behind that entire crusade, and that was the Emperor Emmanuel II, who had come to the throne in 1391 and labored so hard to get the Pope to preach a Western crusade against Bayezid. I also mentioned that he built the great mosque at Bursa with the 20 domes as a thank offering to his victory at Nicopolis. And then the question comes up, why, after such a successful career, did he end up being defeated so decisively at the Battle of Angora on July 20th, 1402? This was an unexpected defeat. As I hinted in the last lecture, it came out of almost nowhere from the Ottomans. That's perhaps a bit of an exaggeration. And unfortunately for Bayezid, he faced a man who was a brilliant conqueror and clearly to be numbered among the great captains of history, and that is Tamerlane, the so-called Prince of Destruction, the great, at least if not the direct descendant of Genghis Khan, certainly the political descendant of Genghis Khan, who attempted to resurrect the great Mongol Empire in the 14th century. And this battle could have proved a decisive turning point. The Battle of Angora could have had the same historical implications as the Battle of Kursadagh back in 1243, which ended the Seljuk Sultanate, which saw the breakup of the Seljuk Sultanate and brought on the conditions in the 13th and early 14th century that led to the rise of the Ottomans. And so one of the issues in this lecture is, why did that not happen? Why was it that despite this great defeat in 1402, that Mehmed I and Murad II were able not only to restore unity to the Ottoman state, but to go on and build virtually a new Ottoman Empire that became the basis for the success of Mehmed the Conqueror, who took Constantinople and literally defined the core lands of the Ottoman Empire for the rest of Ottoman history. Well, this is an exciting part of the story, and it's probably best to first look at that decisive battle. A battle that in many ways would be remembered for centuries by the Ottoman sultans and would not really be equaled again in terms of a magnitude as a defeat until 1697, when another sultan will be defeated by another great captain at the Battle of Zhetna, and that great captain will be Prince Eugene of Savoy. Now, let's look at the situation in 1402. In 1402, Bayezid the Thunderbolt, clearly was at the height of his power. He had the city of Constantinople under siege, and he realized that this clearly was the strategic capital. It could no longer be tolerated that the Byzantine emperor could control that strategic city, which would interrupt the movement of Ottoman forces between Asia and Europe. Furthermore, it gave a position to the Venetians and Genoese, each of which had independent communities in Constantinople, from which they could dominate the commercial trade in the Aegean and Black Sea. And the first thing he did was to blockade the city soon after his victory at Nicopolis, and then he actually tried to reduce the city by siege, and he discovered that he really didn't have the artillery necessary to knock down those walls built in the 5th century AD, the so-called Theodosian walls. And so essentially that siege degenerated into more or less a blockade rather than an actual siege. He also realized he did not have a fleet by which he could interdict supplies coming in, especially from Western Europe, to keep the city fed. And so that abortive siege was a very, very important lesson not only to Bayezid, but also to his successors. And Bayezid was probably trying to figure out how to get that city when all of a sudden a new threat came from the east. Tamerlane, who had had poor relations with Bayezid before, there had been disputes over borderlands in Asia Minor. And Tamerlane was particularly eager to control the regions east of the Taurus, which would be the historic lands of Armenia and Azerbaijan, that there had been disputes with Bayezid over those areas, and especially over the independent Turkoman tribes there, whether they owed their allegiance to Tamerlane or to the Sultan Bayezid. And that disputes, however, never got to the point of a major war. Tamerlane was far more intent on taking Baghdad, and his main enemy was the Mamluk Sultan in Egypt, at Cairo. But in 1402, suddenly Tamerlane decided to redeploy his army to Asia Minor, and he invaded Asia Minor, he invaded Anatolia, and began a typical Tamerlane tactic, destroying cities and driving refugees west, spreading horrors of the atrocities. And again, this war broke out over a minor incident, and Bayezid was forced to break off the siege of Constantinople and move against the invader. By 1402, in the spring, the main Ottoman army crossed into Asia Minor and advanced against Tamerlane's army, and the two armies came into contact with each other at Angora, a town famous for the later Angora wool, which we'll talk about later on, which is in the economic lectures in this course. In any event, it's close to Ankara. And the result of this was a great battle on July 20th, 1402. Tamerlane had the superior army. It is estimated at 135,000 men. He also had an elephant corps he had brought from India, and his men were tough veterans from repeated wars in Central Asia and in Iran. Bayezid, however, had very good forces as well, but it was a very, very mixed army. It included many Christian vassals, including Stefan, the Grand Prince of Serbia, the son of King Lazar, who had been defeated at the Battle of Kosovo back in July of 1389. And ironically, it would be the Christian knights, the Serbian knights, who would fight most valiantly for Bayezid. The army of Tamerlane occupied the field first. They seized control of the river, the so-called Çabuk Çaya, which essentially means swift river in Turkish. They dammed it up, denied the Ottoman army water in the heat of the summer, and anyone who's ever been on the plateau in July knows how important water is. And so when the Turkish army, the Ottoman army, went into battle, they had a number of liabilities on their side. Nonetheless, Bayezid adopted the tactic that had worked many times before. His janissaries occupied the center, a high point. His cavalry was to flank. It was hoped that the Mongol army would throw itself on the center, would be repelled, and the Ottoman counterattack would drive him from the field. Well, it didn't happen that way. The center was absolutely crushed by a violent attack. The Elephant Corps did a good deal of damage. Bayezid was captured in the fighting, despite the efforts of his Serbian knights to try to rescue him, led by, of course, the Prince Stefan himself. The result was a catastrophe. Bayezid was taken in captivity. He died in Samarkand as a prisoner of Tamerlane, and Tamerlane then divided the Ottoman realm into two weak states. Two sons of Bayezid were appointed vassal sultans. One was named Isa, which is the Turkish Arabic name for Jesus, and he was given Bursa, Isa Çelebi, and he was to rule the Anatolian provinces. The other one was given to his half-brother, and he would rule from Edirne, and his name was Suleiman. And so it was thought that these two weak states would simply render tribute to Tamerlane, and Tamerlane took off for the east soon afterwards. His interest was to lead eventually a campaign against China, in which he died early in 1405. He never made it to China. But the Ottoman state was essentially a wreck. And the defeat at the Battle of Angora underscored some of the weaknesses in that early Ottoman state. For one, it was not really a coherent empire. The nice word we use for it is a tributary empire. And what that means is, ever since the reign of Orhan, many of these areas that are conquered and that we color in on the map as Ottoman are really held by vassal rulers, and they're different types of arrangements. What the defeat underscored, as well as that partition, is there were literally two halves to the Ottoman state. One was in Asia, the other was in Europe. And let's think about that for a moment. In Asia Minor, with the exception of some of the Byzantine territories taken by Osman and Orhan, most of your opponents were Turkish foes. They were Turkish rulers. And whenever the Ottomans went to war with these Turkish rulers, they had to have a very good justification. So they're not violating Sharia, that is, warring against a fellow Muslim. And so these wars took on more of the aspect of dynastic interventions, and invariably victory ended up in co-opting the defeated. In some instances, local rulers were essentially co-opted into an expanded Ottoman aristocracy. And we know of a number of families where this happened, where they ended up essentially leaving their independent positions to work at the court of Bursa or Edirne. And one of them will be the family of the great Grand Vizier Mehmet II Halil. His family were independent rulers, and they essentially gave up and became one of the imperial families of the Ottoman state. Many of the Turkish soldiers who had fought against him in these independent states like Karaman or Din or whatever, they ended up simply holding their land tenures now under the Sultan. The other half of the empire was Rumelia, that is the Balkan areas. And that was an area that was largely conquered from Christians. And that meant every conquest meant you could hand out timirs and reward your Ottoman soldiers. And therefore, there was constantly war against the Christians. But even in this area, even in the European provinces, there was a great deal of co-opting of Christian princes. The son of Lazar, who fell fighting at the Battle of Nicopolis in July of 1389, his son Stefan became a very, very loyal vassal to Bayezid the Thunderbolt. And his sister was actually admitted into the harem of Bayezid the Thunderbolt. And Bayezid had already realized that this state had certain weaknesses to it. And part of the reasons he was defeated at the Battle of Angora in 1402 was not because just of the military genius of Tamerlane. Let's not in any way underplay that. But also, during the course of the battle, many of his Muslim subjects did not fight nearly as hard as those Christian vassals because they had become fed up with Bayezid as an imperious, imperial-type figure. He was resident primarily at Edirne, and he inherited Byzantine traditions. He had within his harem princesses from the various Christian kingdoms who came with great retinues. And he liked the imperial pretensions, the idea of being a Caesar. And so he tried to rule those Anatolian provinces far more directly than his predecessors had. And he discovered, as later sultans would, that if you rule from the great capital, Edirne and later Constantinople, with any kind of centralizing imperial authority, you're going to immediately alienate the Turkish nobility, and particularly that Turkish nobility that dominated the great regimental tribal armies that were so important to the Ottoman army. And so at the Battle of Angora, a number of those soldiers just gave up early and fled the battle. They didn't quite defect. They did not fight for him. And it really underscored the weakness of that state, which was not lost on his successors, Mehmed I and Murad II, who would then carry out major reforms to transform that state from a tributary empire to what we call a bureaucratic empire. And to put it bluntly, as we'll be coming up when we deal with Ottoman institutions, that is an empire based on slaves and sanjaklar. A sanjak is a province. It's an administrative unit of the Ottoman state. It's still used in modern Turkish to designate a district. And the sanjaks, or the sanjaklar, to use the proper Turkish plural, would be provinces who would be run by governors, and these governors would generally be personal agents of the Sultan and therefore his slaves. They would be kula, as you would say in Turkish, a kul, a slave. And they would be the men swept up in this Janissary levy that I've mentioned about, many of them converts to Islam, some of them brought in as young men who were converted and trained to be the elite soldiers and administrators of the Sultan. And that was a very distinct change, because increasingly you're going to replace that Turkish nobility, that Turkish elite, who were the heirs to the great warrior traditions of the Central Steppes, with a new class of soldiers and administrators who are recruited from the conquered population, who represent converts, and who are personally loyal to the Sultan. Bayezid was already making the first moves in that change. Defeat at Angara would lead his successors to very much, they would very, very much begin to build on that system. So that is what the significance of Angora was, and also the lessons of why they were defeated were not lost, as I said, on Bayezid's successors. Now, in 1402, the situation in the Ottoman state was really quite desperate. Invariably, these half-brothers went to war with each other. And from 1402 until probably 1413, 1415, when Mehmed I, he comes to the throne in 1413, and within 2 years, he's united those two realms really into a single Ottoman state. The civil wars were absolutely chaotic, and in many ways, Western Europe lost interest in the issue, although the Byzantine emperor in Constantinople, Manuel II, one of the most astute emperors ever on the throne, only to be matched by his final successor, his son Constantine XI, he knew full well that the Ottoman state could recover. The Byzantines had excellent spies and information at the courts, and what they reported in Western Europe was unheeded. Mehmed I was able to end that civil war because he gained control of Rumelia, that is the European provinces, which were all essential to rebuilding the Ottoman state. The European provinces offered the chances for expansion in the name of Islam. You could hand out more timars to reward your followers. Furthermore, the Balkans had excellent fighting men, which could be recruited into the Janissary Corps. It had the timber, it had the mineral wealth. And above all, crucial cities like Salonika or Thessalonica, to use its ancient name, which was the leading port in northern Greece. All of these areas were vital to the rebuilding of the Ottoman state. And so long as the Ottomans maintained the Balkans, they were a power. And the loss of those Balkans in the early 20th century would really put the Ottoman Empire behind the eight ball. Well, Mehmed I was able to reunify the empire. He also was able to beat back pretenders who were paid by the Byzantine emperor. The Byzantine emperor tried to set up Mehmed's uncle as a counter-sultan. There was a very, very bad civil war which had to be done, had to be ended. Mehmed also found that he ran into trouble with the Byzantines intriguing with Venice. When the Byzantines could not hold the city of Thessalonica in 1423, they essentially sold it to Venice. It was the most important city in Greece. It was the center of silk manufacturing. It will later become really one of the great cities of the Ottoman Empire and a very, very important residence for the Jewish community. That city was sold to the Venetians, who undertook its defense. And from 1423 to 1430, the Ottomans put that city under siege. And the Sultan at the time, Murad II, realized that to control these vital cities, you would have to have a fleet and you have to be beware of Venice. And so Mehmed I and then his successor and son, Murad II, realized that the Byzantines were a real threat. And the revival of the state required the capture of Constantinople. In 1422, Murat II, who succeeded to Mehmed I, put Constantinople under siege. And that siege only lasted a couple of months between August and September, and it had to be called off again because inadequate artillery. And then Murat got involved in his war with Venice. The real danger was the threat in the Balkans. Mehmed I and Murat II both realized that the victory at Nicopolis was tentative. The defeat at the Battle of Angora in 1402 shattered the image of Ottoman invincibility. And both sultans had to struggle to reimpose their authority on the Christian client states. And that's why they increasingly shift over to annexing former client states as provinces. One of the worst offenders was the Prince of Serbia, George Brankovic, who essentially shook off his Ottoman overlordship and turned back to Hungary. King Sigismund, the man defeated at Nicopolis, was determined to lead a new crusade. He was supported by all sorts of foes of the Ottomans. Sigismund died before he could undertake that crusade, but the Hungarian Diet elected a new king. And that king's name was Vladislav I. He was actually the Jagiellonian king of Poland. And he came to the throne in Hungary in 1440 with the intent of waging that crusade to undo Ottoman power in the Balkans, which had become increasingly alarming in Western Europe, thanks to the reports first of Manuel II and then of his son John VIII, who made every effort to try to bring a Christian coalition down on top of the Ottoman state. The result is a crusade was preached, and it turned out to be a who's who of foes of the Ottomans in the Balkans. The young king of Hungary, Poland, would head it up. He had the blessings of the papacy behind it. That would be Pope Eugenius IV, one of the great Renaissance popes. Furthermore, Venice and Genoa were willing to provide naval support, just as they had done back in 1396. They would provide a fleet that once that crusade penetrated either the Black Sea or the Aegean, that would assist the crusaders. They would also provide the logistical support as the crusade marched down the Danube through the Iron Gates into Ottoman territory, with its first objective, Nicopolis, just as it had been back in 1396. In addition to that, the Prince of Transylvania, John Hunyadi, one of the great opponents to the Ottomans, who had fought especially Murat II in the Balkans over control of the Serbians, he was going to lead up the crusade and actually do the real strategic work to it. And again, it was filled with all sorts of Western Europeans moved by a crusading ideal to stop the Turk, the Ottoman menace, which had now become essentially associated in European minds with Islam. And starting with this crusade, really, when Christians speak of crusades, they mean a war against the Ottomans. And that's seen all through the language of the 15th and 16th century, especially when we get to the reigns of Suleiman the Magnificent. So this crusade marched off to overthrow the Ottoman state. At the time, the Sultan, Murat II, had retired. He had abdicated in 1444. He went into a contemplative life as a Sufi acolyte. He was in Asia Minor. He had restored the Ottoman state. He'd carried out important administrative reforms, building upon the provincial organization I spoke of, the Sanjak. He also had helped reorganize the Janissary Corps, we'll be talking about, and decided it was time to abdicate. And he left power to his young son, Mehmed II, the future Mehmed the Conqueror, Mehmed the Great. He was in the hands of the Grand Vizier Halil, and from the start, the reign was troubled. Mehmed was much too young in order to really run things. He was only a teenager. Even though he had been brilliantly trained, nonetheless, he really had been thrust into government, largely because his father had been disinterested in continuing. In many ways, I always think that Murat II was much more a man of peace and administration rather than a man of war. And once he had done his job, it was time to get out. He had actually arranged treaties with the Hungarian kingdom to define the borders, and he expected the Christians to behave. The Christians actually violated those treaties when they decided to invade in 1444, when they'd finally put that crusade together. So as this crusade moved down the Danube and reached the city of Nicopolis in September of 1444, there was panic in Edirne. It was an enormous Western army. There was a young sultan to oppose it. In the city of Edirne, there were refugees flying everywhere out of the city to escape the Christian menace. And as I said, Edirne had become the second capital of the empire. It was a Muslim city. It would eventually be home to some of the great mosques in the imperial age. And it is still regarded as a very, very important city in Turkey today. So the city was in a panic. The Grand Vizier Halil, as well as Mehmet II, begged Murat to come out of retirement to lead up the armies. Well, there was a problem. He was in Asia Minor, and the menaces in Europe, and Murat had to evade a Venetian-Genoese blockade in order to get back to Europe to lead the armies. And again, underscoring the importance that Constantinople must be in Ottoman hands. Well, he did arrive in Edirne. He quickly organized his forces, and on September 23rd, 1444, a great battle was fought at the city of Varna. That is a city on the Black Sea to the northeast of Edirne, and what happened is Murat intercepted the Crusader army before it could rendezvous with Venetian-Genoese fleet and forced him into a battle where he could draw up the Ottoman army in its usual tactics. That is, occupy a central hill, the high ground, with your janissaries, now support it with some early field artillery, and flank it with your cavalry. And in this case, despite the warnings of John Hunyadi, the man who should have really been commanding the army, the young king of Hungary, Vladislav, decides to launch a major attack with his cavalry against the janissaries, apparently believing he could break into the tent and kill the Sultan and therefore win the battle. Well, this assault was easily driven off. It was followed by a devastating counterattack, and the result was absolute catastrophe again. The crusade was decisively defeated. John was able to get off the battlefield, but the number of Christian dead was legion. Many of the leading figures went down in fighting. It was a spectacular victory. One even greater than Nicopolis, the second time a Western European army, a Christian Latin army headed up by the King of Hungary, had gone down in ignominious defeat. But it was essentially a defensive victory. From there, the Ottoman state had survived, the reforms of Murat II would go forward, and there was still the danger of a Christian revival. In 1446, Murat II probably would have wanted to retire back into a Sufi life and essentially say, a job well done. But he couldn't do that. There were too many enemies who escaped the battlefield of Varna. The King of Hungary went down fighting. King Vladislav fell fighting in the center of his army. But many of the other princes had escaped. Above all, John Hunyadi. John Hunyadi, the Prince of Transylvania, could reorganize Hungarian resistance. And the Hungarians had occupied the city of Belgrade, which is really the nexus of all the key highways in the Balkans, and had eluded Ottoman power ever since the Ottomans began expanding against Serbia. And that was held now by the Hungarian king. And that could threaten the Ottoman state in Europe with a new crusade. Furthermore, in the battle, there was this colorful figure, Vlad II Dracul, who was the Prince of Wallachia, the Voivode, which is their local name. He threatened the upper Danube because he occupied southern Romania. There was another famous colorful figure, and his name is Skanderbeg, or Skanderbeg, as he's known in the Ottoman sources. His name is George Castriota, or Castriot. He was an Albanian Ottoman official who turned Christian prince, and he would defy Ottoman power in Albania down to his death in 1468 and is still revered as an Albanian national figure. So Murat had to stay on the throne until his death in 1451, when he handed over power to his son, Mehmet II, now aged 19. The achievement of Murat II is still significant. He carried out key administrative reforms that enabled his son and his later descendants not only to conquer, but to rule their conquests. He created a good deal of that provincial administration. He reorganized the janissaries. He made the first efforts to reorganizing artillery and even launched the first Ottoman ships in the war to gain Thessalonica. But above all, I always like to see his reign as summed up by the last great architectural complex at Bursa, the sacred city, the first capital of the Ottoman state. And there is there a great Muradia, a great complex built by Murad over the course of his reign, with a great mosque and all of the attendant buildings, and above all, a series of mausoleums, a series of turbula, which would come to be the burial ground of many of the imperial figures of the Ottoman state who were not sultans but deserved a noble burial. And we'll be talking about these figures in coming lectures. And the Muradia became, in effect, the final summation of that early sultanate before the capture of Constantinople. It is architecturally a brilliant effort in domed work and a fitting conclusion to a man who did so much to restore Ottoman power after the disaster of Angora.